Mark wakes up at 5:47 in the morning, before the alarm even has a chance to go off, in a house that is quiet in a way that used to feel peaceful and now just feels empty. He makes his coffee the same way he has for 20 years. Doesn't measure anything, doesn't need to. He stands at the kitchen window for a minute, maybe two, and looks out at a street where a few garages are already open. Other men getting into trucks before the sun is fully up. Mark is 52 years old. He has not called a friend just to talk in longer than he can remember. He has not cried in front of another person since his father's funeral, and even then he stepped outside first. He gets in his car, turns the radio to something he's heard 1,000 times, and drives to a job he's good at, that he's held for 11 years, that he has never once described as fulfilling. Nobody asks him if he's okay. He wouldn't know what to say if they did. This is not a man in crisis. This is a man in routine. And that, more than anything, is the story. Watch him for a week and you'll start to notice the pattern beneath the pattern. He fixes things before anyone asks him to. The gutter, the fence post, the noise the dishwasher makes. He does this quietly, without announcement, and he does not expect thanks, because thanks was never really the point. He checks in on his aging parents by doing something practical, mowing their lawn, changing a light bulb, rather than by sitting down and asking how they're feeling. He answers, "How are you?" with "can't complain," a phrase so automatic it barely qualifies as language anymore, more like a reflex. He has opinions about nearly everything and shares almost none of them unless directly asked. He keeps a mental ledger of who he owes and who owes him, not in money, but in effort, in showing up, in being dependable. He has a group text with 3 old friends that he has not opened in 4 months. He tells himself he's fine. He mostly believes it. If you asked him what he needed, he would change the subject, not out of evasion exactly, but because the question itself feels foreign, like being asked to speak a language he was never taught. Here is the part that tends to catch people off guard. Researchers who study male friendship have found that by their 50s, a large share of men report having no close confidants at all. No one they could call at 2 in the morning and simply say, "I'm not okay." Mark has a wife, a daughter, co-workers who like him, neighbors who wave every morning, and still, by that definition, he is functionally alone. That's the twist nobody expects when they picture loneliness. It doesn't look like isolation. It looks exactly like a full life. None of this happened by accident. Mark was born into a specific slice of history, the tail end of the Cold War, the beginning of 2 working parents becoming the norm rather than the exception, a childhood where being a latchkey kid wasn't a diagnosis, it was Tuesday. Divorce rates climbed through his formative years, and a lot of Gen X kids learned, early and without being told directly, that adults were unreliable narrators of their own promises. So you adapted. You learned to let yourself in after school. You learned to make your own dinner. You learned that asking for help often returned nothing, so you stopped asking. Sociologists have long pointed to this generation as the most self-sufficient in modern memory, not because self-sufficiency was some virtue they chose, but because it was the operating system installed in them before they had any say in the matter. Add to that a culture that was still, at the time, deeply committed to the idea that men provide and endure, that emotional expression was something other people did, softer people, and you get an entire generation fluent in problem-solving and nearly illiterate in feeling. Friendship for men of this era became something built almost entirely around doing, not talking. Fishing trips. Fixing cars. Watching a game in silence that somehow still counted as connection. It worked for a while, because shared activity can carry a friendship a long way. But activity fades. Schedules fill up. Kids grow up and leave, jobs demand more, and the scaffolding that friendship was built on quietly disappears, leaving nothing underneath it to hold the relationship up. To understand where this really comes from, you have to go back further than adulthood, back to the specific quiet moments in childhood that get written into a person before language even fully forms. Picture a boy 8 or 9 who falls off his bike in front of his father and starts to cry, and the response isn't cruelty exactly, it's a version of "you're fine, get up," said not out of coldness but because that's what the father learned from his own father, a chain of men each handing down the same unspoken rule. Pain gets absorbed, not expressed. That boy doesn't consciously decide to stop feeling things. He decides, without ever framing it as a decision, that feelings are things to be managed privately, processed alone, and definitely not displayed where they could be seen as weakness or, worse, as a burden to someone else. This becomes identity long before it becomes strategy. By the time that boy is a teenager, he has already absorbed the idea that competence equals worth, that being needed is safer than needing, that control over his own emotional world is the one thing that can't be taken from him. This is not weakness dressed up as strength. It is a coping mechanism so early and so consistent that it eventually stops looking like a mechanism at all and simply becomes personality. Psychologists sometimes call this restrictive emotionality, the learned suppression of emotional expression, particularly around vulnerability, sadness, and fear, and studies going back decades have linked it to higher rates of loneliness in men, even as those same men report higher satisfaction with their independence. Both things are true simultaneously, which is exactly the problem. The armor that protected him also isolated him, and by the time he's old enough to notice the isolation, the armor has become so fused to his sense of self that removing it doesn't feel like relief, it feels like exposure. And here is where the real tension lives, the place this story keeps circling back to without ever fully landing. Mark wants connection. Ask him, late at night, honestly, and some version of that truth will surface, that he misses the closeness he used to have with people, that he sometimes envies the way his daughter's friends hug each other and say, "I love you," without flinching. But he will not be the one to make the first move toward that kind of openness, because initiating vulnerability feels, to him, indistinguishable from failure. Men like Mark will drive 4 hours to help a friend move, no complaints, no hesitation, but they will not call that same friend to say, "I've been feeling low lately." They will show up at a hospital at 2 in the morning for someone they love, but they will not say, "I love you" out loud unless it's wrapped in a joke first, some deflection to soften the exposure. This is the contradiction that defines an entire generation of men. Fierce loyalty paired with total emotional silence. Deep capacity for care, delivered entirely through action, never through words. They will fix your car, cover your rent, sit with you in a waiting room for 6 hours without complaint, and still not be able to say simply, "I'm struggling too." It's not that the feeling isn't there. It's that the language for expressing it was never installed, and building it now, in your 50s, feels less like growth and more like starting over as a beginner in something everyone else seems to have learned decades ago. There's a smaller, quieter version of this contradiction that plays out almost daily. A man like Mark will notice when a friend goes quiet on the group text for a few weeks and worry about it privately for days, turning it over on the drive to work, and still never send the text that says, "Hey, you good?" Because some old rule tells him that reaching out first is what needy people do, not steady ones. He will sit through his own father's decline without ever once saying, "This is breaking my heart," choosing instead to handle the paperwork, the doctors, the logistics, as if competence were a substitute for grief rather than a way of avoiding it. The care is real. The delivery system is broken, and because it was built decades before he had any say in the matter, he rarely even recognizes it as broken. He just calls it being practical. So what does it actually cost, this quiet compliance, this decades-long insistence on being fine? What happens to a man who has spent 30 years being the reliable one, the fixer, the one who never complains, when the people who depended on him start needing him less? What happens when the kids move out, the marriage settles into something more like coexistence than partnership, the job stops requiring the same relentless output, and suddenly there is space, actual empty space, where the doing used to be? Is it possible that the very thing that made these men so dependable, so trusted, so needed, is the same thing that left them unequipped to sit with themselves once the need for doing quiets down? Is "I'm fine" ever really a full sentence? Or is it the shortest possible way of saying something much longer that he doesn't have access to? And if a man has built his entire identity around never being a burden, what does he do with pain that has nowhere else to go? Maybe the truth isn't that these men don't feel enough. Maybe it's that they feel exactly as much as anyone else, and simply never inherited a way to let it out that didn't feel like collapse. Maybe strength, as they were taught it, was never really about the absence of pain. It was about the silence around it. And maybe that silence, so useful for so long, so protective in childhoods that offered little other protection, eventually becomes its own kind of weight, one carried alone by design, because that's the only way he was ever shown how to carry anything. Mark will probably read none of this. He isn't the type to search for articles about his own psychology, isn't the type to wonder aloud why he feels the way he feels. He'll wake up tomorrow at 5:47, make the coffee the same way, look out the same window. Maybe nothing changes. Maybe it doesn't need to, not today. But somewhere in that quiet kitchen, in that specific kind of stillness that only men like him seem to carry, there's a version of him that still remembers what it felt like to not have to be fine. Whether he ever lets that version speak again is not really a question this story can answer. It's just the question worth sitting with.